One of the I think tenets of liberation psychology is that nothing is bias is free of bias. Everything has a cultural and social and foundations and origins, and so nothing is bias free. The blank slate does not exist. To be neutral in the work that I do actually would be a disservice to the folks that I work with. Again, I'm not talking about being unethical or discarding the ethics codes or the foundations that keep us from doing harm to the folks that we're working with, but it's also about expanding that perspective to know that who I am as a person has a lot to do with how I work therapeutically, and to try to separate those two things out, I think is a disservice not only myself as a therapist, but also to the people that I'm working with. When I think about neutrality and this idea of not necessarily being neutral in sessions with clients, the first thing that comes to mind is I think self-disclosure is an intervention, a tool that I think is valuable. Again, I think a lot of that depends on the therapeutic orientation and framework and experience of the therapist. But I do think people walking into my office is a form of self-disclosure. So it's not that we're not self-disclosing. It's just in what format and in what way are we choosing to self-disclose. And for many of the clients that I work with, I think self-disclosure in many ways, when it's therapeutically appropriate and really on behalf of those that I'm serving, can become a really, I think, powerful intervention to help clients see some of the issues they might be dealing with. So I have a particular case in mind that I was working with an individual from Mexico, probably immigrated to the United States maybe 10, 15 years ago. He's in his 20s, younger individual. And he's paralyzed from the legs down, and so he has home health care. And there was a situation where initially the home health care, he has home health care daily, and there was a situation where initially the home health care was sending him African American Black women as his home health care providers, and so he was having reactions to these particular women. In fact, the issue of, I think, colorism came up for him in many ways. This idea of the color of one's skin has a lot to do with how people respond to one another, and this idea of colorism comes up within communities of color all the time. And so, as I'm hearing this is a Mexican individual talking about African American women in a very what I would deem racist way and an offensive way. And so I shared with him my reactions to what he was saying as a way to try to help him understand how what he might be saying could be interpreted in ways that he may not intend by somebody else. So I always tell folks, what you see is what you get with me as a therapist, as a human being in many ways. And so if someone is saying something that is overtly racist or offensive or discriminatory towards someone else, at some point I'm always going to respond and to react in a way that helps people understand how I might be reacting to that particular situation, as a way to help them see and understand their own reactions. So one of the things I did with him is I responded, I said, it's hard for me to hear you make those comments because I find that that's a gross generalization of African American Black women. I want to understand why you have that perspective, where maybe that perspective comes from, but I also want you to understand that people say the same thing about you and I. I think that was when I said that to him, he was very much, I think it took him a minute, but he realized, and this is an individual who I would classify as maybe a darker skinned Mexican individual, whereas some people maybe classify me as lighter skinned Mexican individual, and so he probably gets some of that reaction and comments maybe more than I even do. But I said, hey, people respond to us and say the same things about us in that way, and so what do we think about that? What does that mean for you? And when I put it in that context, how does that matter, and how does that make a difference in many ways? I also, we're thinking about liberation psychology. I also brought back together in many ways this notion of, look, you're in some ways perpetuating society's status quo. I didn't use those exact terms, but this notion of when people of underserved, devalued communities are oppressive to one another, in some ways the already existing power structures in society continue to exist as they are, unaffected, unfiltered, etc., which means that we're all going to in some ways continue to be negatively impacted, whether you're black, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Latino, whatever it may be. And so I really communicated to him my own reactions and tried to help him contextualize and situate his comments on a social, environmental level so he might understand a little bit differently.